Now off screen I've put in some base values for the different parts of our modular environment. Let me just zoom in here so that we can start to see some of them. You can see here I've separated them out onto layers. We have the trim bottom, which I can toggle on and off, which is the base color I'm using for the trim. And we also have trim middle, which represents the middle panel that I'm using here. And we also have our background layer, which effectively represents a consolidation of all the other base values I've put in for the top of the wall, the bottom of the wall, and the floor. And really all these values have just been included just by drawing marquee selections and filling it with base color. And since it's blended with the ambient occlusion map, it's still looking quite nice. Notice that it's all in grayscale. And that is because afterwards I might come in and start to paint in the colours separately, keeping the colours separated from the value, which is something that I generally like to do. So we have this sort of arrangement here, and I want to start thinking about the wall tiles over here that we're going to have on the walls. I want to start putting on some tiles on the walls that are sort of extruded and beveled in look. And the way I'm going to start to draw these tiles is by using the grid. So I'm going to choose View and Show Grid so that we can display the grid. And right now it's quite tessellated. I might increase the grid size by choosing Image, and we can choose Configure Grid. I'm going to set this width and height to 30. Maybe 30 is the kind of size I want to use. So I'm about happy with that, I think. So I'm going to start to draw in some tiles for the wall here. And to do that, I'm going to use the Marquee Select tool. So I'm going to choose the Marquee Select tool. I want to enable rounded corners. And let's just draw in, for example, the first tile. Now right now I'm drawing quite loosely and it's not aligned to the grid. So I'm going to enable snapping by choosing View and Snap to Grid. So that now the tiles I draw are going to be aligned to the grid. So let's say that's about the size of one tile. I'm going to zoom in. And I'm not sure that these rounded corners are quite enough, so I'm going to increase the radius of the rounded corners, maybe to something kind of like that, so that you can see the rounded corners there. And that's fine for one tile. I'm going to draw in maybe another tile, so I'm going to hold down the Shift key and draw in a second tile, and maybe draw in another tile there. I'm also going to draw in another 3 height tile, like so, and maybe I'll sort of come over here and see if I can draw another tile somewhere else. Maybe I'm just going to draw another tile there. Now for now, let's say I'm happy with some tiles there. We can of course come in and start to work on these other regions, but let's say I'm happy with these tiles in this place. So I'm going to create a new layer which is going to be used to house all the tiles. So I'm going to accept those defaults. Actually, I'm not going to name it floor, I'm going to name this L wall tiles, like so. And I'm going to select a colour, maybe this sort of grey colour that we have here already, and just press Alt backspace to just fill that with those tiles. And we can see the sort of effect that's taking on there. I'm going to just temporarily hide the grid so we can see those tiles here. Again, notice we've still got these lines through the texture, but that's only because we have the UVs visible. We can turn those off. When we come to create and produce the final texture, we will disable these UVs so that they don't appear in the final texture. But I'm going to leave them as they are for now. Let's say, for example, I want to add a kind of bevel effect to these tiles. Right now they're just a sort of bold colour. They have nice rounded corners, but they don't really look very three-dimensional. So I'm going to select all of these tiles by Alt-clicking on the layer, so you can see that it selects them all. And I'm going to add a decor filter to them by choosing Filters, Decor, and I'm going to choose Add Bevel to add a bevel effect. So I'm going to make sure that Work on Copy is not selected, and I might leave these settings at their defaults. Perhaps I could just increase this, maybe just a bit, and choose OK. And that works away and applies a bevel to these tiles. Maybe I don't think that's quite enough, I want to increase its prominence. Well, I can just run the decor effect a second time and choose OK. And there we've increased the prominence of the effect, and you can see that beveling now around the edges of the tiles. And I think that's looking pretty good. So there we've created a basic tile just by using the selection tool, the fill tool, and the bevel filter. So off screen I've been working away and creating these tiles for the wall, which you can see here. And I've also gone ahead and created tiles for the floor, larger tiles here, just using the rectangular marquee select tool. And I've applied beveling to those selections. And again, even along here, I've created a kind of small computer for the wall, a computer console. And again, I've done all of this just by using the marquee select tool. So what we have created really is just more tiles, floor tiles and wall tiles. The only thing that I have done, which I haven't shown you and I'm going to show you now, is how I created this black border around the tiles. You can see I've added this black border to sort of emphasize the tiles and make them more prominent in the wall. And the way that I do that really is just by making a selection somewhere in the image. So for example, let's say I'm going to draw a selection in here. You can see that we have the marching ants just running around. And I want to select a color to apply for the border. So I'm going to move over here to the color select tool and just change the color to black and choose OK. And to apply a fill or a stroke around that border, all I have to do is choose Edit, and I choose Stroke Selection, like so. And I choose, well, let's say solid color, add a line width of 6 pixels, and choose Stroke. And straight away you can see now that it has painted a stroke around that selection. But of course I don't want a select stroke there, I just wanted to show you how I achieved that. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that. And the thing I want to start thinking about now is what we've been doing so far is painting all of this texture in grayscale. And I want to start thinking now about adding some color. But of course I want to keep the color separate from the value so that I can control both independently. So let's create a new layer in here. I'm just going to choose New Layer, and I'm going to call this layer Color. So I'm going to choose Color and choose OK. And I'm going to move this layer upwards in the stack, near the top, but not quite on the top, beneath the UV layer. So about there. And I have this new color layer. So for example, let's say that I wanted to start adding some color to perhaps the lower wall area here. Well, I can switch to the channels palette and I can say, well, let's find the floor here. So let's say the upper wall. So I'm going to scroll down, hold down the Alt key and click on the upper wall to select the upper wall part here. I'm going to switch back to the layers palette and make sure that my color layer is selected here. Let's say, for example, that I wanted this to be a kind of, I don't know, maybe a sort of a green color, a green hue. Well, I can move over here to the color selection picker and maybe pick out maybe something like this and choose OK. I'm going to switch to the brush tool, so I'm going to increase the size of my brush here, and I want this to be a hard brush. So I don't want something that's going to have a hard edge. And I can start painting in here, but you'll see that when I do that, I'm just painting really over all of those tiles. The only thing I can see on top of this painting are really the UVs, which are on this layer here. But I can change the blending mode of this layer from normal, and I can select, it's out of the window, but there's a mode called color. If I select color, you'll see that now what I'm doing is I'm just colorizing those values. So I'm maintaining the value, we still get the lights and the darks. You can see in this beveling, we've still got the dark shadows here, we've still got the highlights up here, and all I'm doing is just adding color to that value. We even keep the effect of the ambient occlusion. So by using this color blending mode, we can keep all of these grayscale values and preserve all of them and just add color on top of them. This is a really smart way to work, and I recommend you do it. So off screen, what I'm going to do is start to apply some color now using the brush tool. I have a pen tablet, I can start painting those in and just adding in some color just using the color blend mode. So now I've painted in the remaining tiles and other pieces of the texture, and I've got them just pretty much how I like it. One thing I just wanted to mention is that I created the kind of texture effect we have here for the floor tiles. You'll know that it's not just a bold color, but it has some texture to it, and I really just achieved that by just selecting the brush tool and selecting maybe a rough brush like so, and just painting in with the rough brush. So I created that variation by just using a rough brush there. So we have all of this texture data and it's looking okay, but one thing I do feel is that perhaps the contrast is a little low. It's pretty bland in terms of the different values. So now I want to increase this contrast, but I want to do it non-destructively. I don't want to start coming in and changing any of the original layers. So what I'm going to do is create a new layer based on all the currently visible layers. I've turned off the UVs here. So I'm going to right click on this layer and choose New from Visible. Hopefully that's in the recording window. If it isn't, there's an option on the menu that says New from Visible, which creates a completely new layer from all the visible layers here. So we have this layer, and that is a complete consolidation of all the currently visible layers, so all of these other layers beneath. And I want to come in and just change the contrast for this layer, and I'm going to do that using the Curves tool. So to do that I can choose Colors and I can choose Curves, which brings up the curve editor here. So we have our shadows, midtones and highlights. So I'm going to darken up the shadows by inserting a point here and just pulling down that curve just to darken up those shadows a bit more here. And I'm going to come in and brighten up the highlights because, again, that's what contrast involves, brightening the highlights and darkening the shadows to get something maybe kind of like that I'm happy with. I don't want to change it too much, but I think that this sort of contrast level maybe is fine. So something like that. I can see the before and the after, and in fact I'm just going to brighten up those shadows just a little bit. But when I turn the preview off, you can just really see just what a difference this makes. See how low contrast it was before, and now when I apply it, it looks much better. And I'm going to choose OK to that. And those changes just apply to that layer I have consolidated here, not the layers beneath, and you can see the difference here between on and off. GIMP does not have adjustment layers as you might find in Photoshop, so that's why I created this duplicate layer to work on, so I can have a non-destructive workflow. So in order to export this image into Blender and apply it to our models, I need to save it as a PNG file. So I can do that by choosing File and then Export from the menu. And I'm going to give this a name, maybe, for example, Texture, and choose Export. These options, really, I can just disable all the settings on this box and choose Export. And then this will go ahead and run away and start to export my image. It takes quite a while to consolidate all those layers. And there it has consolidated them all and exported it into that image. If I come along and start to make changes to this file, I can easily just overwrite the exported file by choosing File and Export to Texture.png again, and this time it won't prompt me with a save dialog, it will just overwrite that file immediately. So that's a pretty quick way to work. So now I've got this Texture.png file, and I'm going to import that into Blender to texture our models, and we'll see how to do that next. Now here, back in my Blender scene, we have our environment pieces, and while I was creating the texture, I did jump back and forwards between Blender and GIMP, loading in my texture, checking it out to see how it looked on the models, going back into GIMP, making changes to the texture, then back into Blender, and so on and so forth. The way I've presented the material in this course may make it look as though I did all my work in GIMP and then I moved the texture into Blender, but that's not quite true. I did jump backwards and forwards between the applications just to see what the texture looked like in 3D, and I think that's an important thing to do. But what I'm going to show you in this video is how I load the texture into Blender and apply it to our models. So I'm going to move over here into the UV editor and choose Image and Open Image. I'm going to then select the environment texture, which I've named mod environment.png, and I'm going to load that into the texture view. If I were to jump back to GIMP and make changes to the texture, and I wanted to reload those changes back in Blender, I don't need to go image, open image again. You'll notice that there's an option here for reload image, and the keyboard shortcut is Alt-R. So all I would need to do is hover my mouse over the UV editor and press Alt-R on the keyboard, and that will reload the texture back, including all its changes. But of course this texture has not been applied to the model in the viewport here. We're going to take care of that now. I'm going to select the model, press the Tab key to enter the object edit mode. I'm going to select all the faces in the model and then change the image from the AO map, and I'm going to change it to our mod environment texture. And now in the viewport you can see the texture is applied to all of our models, and everything here is looking pretty good. So you can see we've got this wall piece, the floor piece, some crate here. We've got a kind of tank prop over here. We've got a corner piece as well over here, some straight section of the wall. We've got the floor pieces with some kind of grate and the open turn over there. So the only thing that's left to do now really is to come back into this model and start to separate out the individual pieces again, making them separate pieces that we can prepare to export into Unity. And I'm going to be taking a look at how to do that next. Now back in Blender here we have these objects. We have our object as one integrated mesh, and it has the texture applied to the different pieces. Our objective now is to really separate out these independent pieces and make them as standalone meshes that we can prepare for export into Unity. Now separating them out, we're going to be doing it individually, one piece at a time. I'm going to show you how to export one of them, but that process applies to them all. So let's go into edit mode by pressing the Tab key on the keyboard, and let's identify the piece that, for example, we want to separate. So I'm going to start with this piece here, for example, and all I have to do is enter vertex mode. So I'm going to select vertex mode, and I'm going to find just one vertex on the mesh that I want to separate. So I'm just going to select that one vertex at the corner there. And then having done that, all I'm going to do then is move over here to the select menu and choose select and choose linked, which is here, or I can press Ctrl L on the keyboard. So I'm going to press Ctrl L, and when I do that it selects all of the linked vertices in this network which composes this mesh. So now I've selected all the vertices on this mesh piece. Now to separate all of these vertices, I choose Mesh, Vertices, Separate, and Selection. That will now separate that selection. So if I exit and go back to object mode, you can see we have all these pieces which are still part of one object. But we have this piece, which is a completely separate and independent object now. But one thing you will notice is that the pivot point, or the origin of this object, is set way over here. It is not where it was originally. So I want to change the pivot point back to this corner of the mesh. So to do that I'm going to make sure this mesh is selected, not the larger multiple mesh piece. This single piece is selected. Press the Tab key on the keyboard to go into edit mode. And I'm going to select the vertex that I want to be the origin. So I'm going to select that vertex. Make sure I'm in vertex mode and select that vertex. And I'm going to move the 3D cursor to this position by choosing Mesh, Snap, and Cursor to Selected. And the 3D cursor will then move to that vertex. I'm then going to exit edit mode by pressing the Tab key again. So now I'm back in object mode. And to move the origin of this model to the 3D cursor, all I have to do is select Object and Transform and Origin to 3D Cursor. And that moves the pivot point of this object back to the 3D cursor location. And now that I've done that, well then it's pretty simple. All I have to do is I can just enable incremental snapping, and I'm free to just transform this back to the origin if I wish. And now that I've got this piece separated out, I can just move it to a completely new layer by choosing Object, Move to Layer, and I can pick whatever layer I want. This is now a completely separate and independent piece, just as it was before, except this time it has all the seams built in and the texture applied. Now this is the way we go about separating out these pieces ready for export into Unity. The actual export process itself is something that I will cover in the next part of this course. So really, with that said, that completes this second part focused on UV unwrapping and texturing. I hope you found it informative. I've been Alan Thorne. Thank you for watching 3dmotive.com.